Welcome to the 72nd edition of Make Pro Wrestling Majestic again. I am Tiger Height.
And I am still your Majestic champion, Peanut Gallery.
You did not defend it.
That's true, I didn't.
So, let's talk about what we're doing for this show because it's a little bit different. So, before we get into your part, we went to the NJPW Autumn Action Show in Las Vegas.
Yes.
So we're going to be talking about that later. But for right now, Peanut Gallery, what are we talking about?
We're going to talk about wrestling that can be done anywhere, like arenas and stadiums and all sorts of other fun things. So obviously wrestling has a history of being held in many different types of venues. So I'm not talking about specific venues because that's your section.
Yes.
But I'm going to talk about the types of venues and the advantages and disadvantages to them.
I'm actually surprised you didn't even bring up where wrestling started, and that was in the circus and flea markets.
Well, yeah. So it started in essentially outdoor settings, venues, and they were part of those sideshows. They were part of the carnivals. They were part of the
flea markets. There were flea market wrestling.
Like there was in a venue that has a very similar setup to stadiums, and why I want to talk first about arenas, and why I want to talk about arenas first is because naturally those types of venues also had an arena-esque feel to it.
Right.
So when television became a thing and cities started developing their own arenas, wrestling naturally progressed into those venues.
Right, because wrestling, even at that time, was still popular.
Yeah.
When was the first? Do you know when the first arena was built?
Oh no! Arenas have been around for centuries up to this point.
Right.
But wrestling within a modern arena setup, obviously, its advantage being that it's already set up for television and it already has that capacity.
It already has the lighting.
Right.
There's production stuff that's already associated with. With other sports, so it was a natural transition into it.
And it also works well for camera setups as well because of the way that the stadium is or the arena is laid out. And we contrast that with stadiums, which are becoming more common with WWE.
Well, they're doing it for the big shows.
Right.
They're not doing it for. They try to do it for any regular show, but now I think they just kind of learn their lesson and they don't do that.
Right.
So it's a much larger.
Right. And obviously one of the disadvantages being from a fan standpoint, it's not very conducive to watching the show live because of the fact that it is on a much larger playing surface. And so
if you get those nosebleed seats, it's going to be a lot harder to see them. Now, it's not impossible. You and I, when we went to SummerSlam a couple of years ago, when it was in Allegiant, which was this event, I didn't think that we did all that bad. I thought we actually had okay-ish seats, even though we were a little bit higher.
Yeah, they were okay. They weren't the best, but they were okay.
Right.
Well,
also they cut the stadium in half.
Oh, yes, and that's another thing that we have to bring up too, because the stadium is not always at full capacity.
Exactly.
The only time that they're ever at full capacity is for WrestleMania.
Right.
And even then, there's large parts of the arena or the stadium that are not used. That are not used because of the entrance and the hard camera stuff, and so that can be difficult to again from a live standpoint.
I think them, especially for SummerSlam, cutting this stadium in half was a good idea. Not only to get that hard camera, but also so people can see.
Yeah. Because
they've had issues in the past of people not being able to see anything because they've booked it in such a big arena.
Right.
And this is in contrast with I think you'll get into it later.
Right. Let's get into the next one here, which is again
it's a theater, an amphitheater,
yes, right? A literal amphitheater, which of course visually doesn't look the best.
I think it personally looks cool. I've always liked when they did shows in dailies.
Right.
Always.
But there is a sense that is the style that they set up anyways, because if you think about SummerSlam and a stadium show like that, you are going to have a setup that is very similar to what an amphitheater is, because you'll always have one section where everyone's there, and then the other side, now this is not necessarily the case for Daly's place, but then the other side is reserved for the hard camera and for fewer fans.
Right.
So
well, I mean, I think Daily Place is a great example of that hard camera angle nonsense, because I think that whole cartoning off that specific place for the hard camera is nonsense. They've done it before. They do it here. There's the hard camera angle is the people are literally right behind the hard camera.
Right.
So them doing that, I think it's more of a capacity restriction than it is an actual issue. So people saying, "Oh, they have to fill it in a certain way," I think it's nonsense. That's just me, though. If you can't sell out the arena, you cannot sell out the arena. There's nothing wrong with that. But
they try not to. But if you go to like a Raw or a SmackDown WWE event, there will be instances where the seating is only on one side, akin to what this would be essentially an amphitheater style setup.
And like I said, I like it. I think it's like that personal thing, and we're going to talk about that when we get into Sam's Town, because we always like going to those.
Let's talk about the next venue. Let's talk about studios, which are another great example of ways in which wrestling arenas have been set up. Now, obviously, a studio is not a professional wrestling, is not a very large professional wrestling venue, but it certainly has the production, I think, that they want as well.
Right.
So this actually was the start of this. Actually goes way back to syndicated television days, when you would have to do it inside of a studio.
Yep.
So again, the setup is kind of weird and wonky, but this is how they used to do it. And of course, NWA being wanting to go to that style is
I think it still works well for what they do with it. It's a little more personal.
It's a very intentional style of creating.
What I like about this
production.
What I like about this style of wrestling is that it becomes very personal. Mm-hmm. And the fans, no matter what seats they are able to grab, they're going to get a good experience.
Right.
And everybody is on the same playing field. If you get first row, cool. If you don't, not a big deal, because you still have this visual from like this perspective. You get to see everything. Yeah. Nothing is out of the ordinary, which is what I personally like about it.
Right.
But that's just me. And I think visually they do a great job with NWA, given their probably smaller budget, despite Billy Corgan being a multimillionaire. I think
he's not going to blow his entire budget on this. But again, this is how they used to have to do it, and Billy Corgan bringing it back like this is very intentional on his part. Now let's talk about ballrooms like Sam's Town, because Sam's Town technically is a ballroom.
This was a nightclub.
Or
the Rebellion was
it was.
This venue was a nightclub, which is another one I really like.
Yeah, but here's what I'm getting at though, is that a ballroom is a specific type of room that is used for professional wrestling shows. Now, is it akin to what you would expect? It's not an arena. It's a specific facility that uses multiple. You can do it for weddings, for proms, for a bunch of different things.
Right. It's just a very large room that you can fit anything in there to make it work. I mean, you can have wrestling, and then the next day you can have a quinceañera. Like, it can literally be that drastic in this situation, where I think, some people do it better than others. Impact Wrestling has done it fairly well. We can have some pros and cons when we get to how New Japan did it, because they did it very differently.
They did.
But I think I actually have always really liked this visually when they did that Rebellion in when they did it in the nightclub. I thought that was a really cool venue for wrestling, and we will talk about another nightclub-esque place that actually does wrestling back in the day.
Right.
But I like this visually. And then obviously,
of course, you got a more traditional sort of ballroom with NWA when they did their show at the Chase. Now, what are the pros and cons to having a ballroom style venue?
It limits your attendance, but at the same time, that you give everybody a decent experience.
Yes.
And I think you have to kind of look at it. If you're going to be a promoter, you have to look at it as, do I want a larger building to make it look good on television?
Right.
Or do I want it more personal, still make it look good? Because the NWA still makes their shows look really good with how they do their camera angles, but then it's a lot more personable. People will go out of their way to go to a thing like that.
Right.
But when WWE comes into town, as an example, you're like, gotta have to go down to the arena. Not a big deal. Not a big fan of that.
Right.
We're gonna worry about that later.
So, you know, those types of venues, great. Not really akin to sports, but or entertainment for that matter, because it's not really set up for those types of things.
You'd be surprised.
But yeah, it really just depends on how much you bring it to the table.
Right.
You know, so those are just a couple of examples of types of venues that wrestling has either traditionally or currently been involved in. And so what can we gather from that? So, you know, obviously arenas are the best in terms of the infrastructure that's there, where you don't have to bring a lot of new stuff in because it's already built for the purpose of
there's already audio. There's already like modified audio stuff, and we're not saying that there's no production in it whatsoever. They don't have a cookie cutter for everything, but it's like you have the space to make a big grandiose show with a very elaborate entrance, and you have pyro, and you have all of this. Where, you know, in a place like NWA or Impact, don't do that.
Right, you can't have that kind
Well, no, I mean, you can have pyro, but it's not necessary. You have to be a little more creative with what you're doing.
Right.
So, you know, but at the same time, you get I personally get a much better experience when I go to a smaller place, because I get to be right there.
Right.
And they're not as protected, so you can have an interaction with these wrestlers and get to know the person, which I really do enjoy.
Right. So, you know, and like I said, the problem with smaller venues, of course, from a production from a production standpoint, is you got to bring a lot more to the table.
Right.
Because they're not built for sports events. They're really built as a multi-purpose, multi-use venue. So you kind of have to play around with it, so to speak.
Right. A little more creativity has to be done in an arena-based show, or not an arena-based show, in a smaller setting like a ballroom, as a subtraction to an arena. Right.
So those are just a couple of things, and then, you know, of course, sound stages. It's just going for that look. So that's kind of what I got. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, not entirely. So when we come back, I'm going to be talking about professional wrestling venues in general. So we're going to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.